Section 3: The Rise of Inequality. Industrial capitalism realized the greatest advances in efficiency and productivity that the world had ever seen. Massive new companies marshaled capital on an unprecedented scale and provided enormous profits that created unheard-of fortunes. But it also created millions of low-paid, unskilled, unreliable jobs with long hours and dangerous working conditions. The notion of a glittering world of wealth and technological innovation masking massive social inequities and deep-seated corruption gave the era its most common label, the Gilded Age, which drew from the title of an 1873 satirical novel written by Mark Twain and Charles Warner. Industrial capitalism confronted Gilded Age Americans with unprecedented inequalities. The sudden appearance of the extreme wealth of industrial and financial leaders alongside the crippling squalor of the urban and rural poor shocked Americans. This association of poverty with progress is the great enigma of our times, economist Henry George wrote in his 1879 bestseller Progress and Poverty. The great financial and industrial titans, the so-called robber barons, including railroad operators such as Cornelius Vanderbilt, oilmen such as John D. Rockefeller, steel magnates such as Andrew Carnegie, and bankers such as J.P. Morgan, won fortunes that, adjusted for inflation, are still among the largest the nation has ever seen. According to various measurements, in 1890, the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned 1/4 of the nation's assets. The top 10% owned over 70%, and inequality only accelerated. By 1900, the richest 10% controlled perhaps 90% of the nation's wealth. As these vast and unprecedented new fortunes accumulated among a small number of wealthy Americans, new ideas arose to bestow moral legitimacy upon them. In 1859, British naturalist Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution through natural selection in his On the Origin of Species. It was not until the 1870s, however, that those theories gained widespread traction among biologists, naturalists, and other scientists in the United States and, in turn, challenged the social, political, and religious beliefs of many Americans. One of Darwin's greatest popularizers, the British sociologist and biologist Herbert Spencer, applied Darwin's theories to society and popularized the phrase survival of the fittest. The fittest, Spencer said, would demonstrate their superiority through economic success, while state welfare and private charity would lead to social degeneration. It would encourage the survival of the weak. There must be complete surrender to the law of natural selection, the Baltimore Sun journalist H. L. Mencken wrote in 1907, "All growth must occur at the top. The strong must grow stronger, and that they may do so, they must waste no strength in the vain task of trying to uplift the weak." By the time Mencken wrote those words, the ideas of social Darwinism had spread among wealthy Americans and their defenders. Social Darwinism identified a natural order that extended from the laws of the cosmos to the workings of industrial society. All species and all societies, including modern humans, the theory went, were governed by a relentless competitive struggle for survival. The inequality of outcomes was to be not merely tolerated, but encouraged and celebrated. It signified the progress of species and societies. Spencer's major work, Synthetic Philosophy, sold nearly 400,000 copies in the United States by the time of his death in 1903. Gilded Age industrial elites such as Carnegie, Edison, and Rockefeller were among Spencer's prominent followers. Other American thinkers, such as Yale's William Graham Sumner, echoed his ideas. Sumner said, "Before the tribunal of nature, a man has no more right to life than a rattlesnake. He has no more right to liberty than any wild beast. His right to pursuit of happiness is nothing but a license to maintain the struggle for existence." But not all so eagerly welcomed inequalities. The spectacular growth of the U.S. economy and the ensuing inequalities in living conditions and incomes confounded many Americans. As industrial capitalism overtook the nation, it secured political protections. Although both major political parties facilitated the rise of big business and used state power to support the interests of capital against labor, big business looked primarily to the Republican Party. The Republican Party had risen as an anti-slavery faction committed to free labor, but it was also an ardent supporter of American business. Abraham Lincoln had been a corporate lawyer who defended railroads, and during the Civil War, the Republican national government took advantage of the wartime absence of Southern Democrats to push through a pro-business agenda. The Republican Congress gave millions of acres and dollars to railroad companies. Republicans became the party of business, and they dominated American politics throughout the Gilded Age and the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Of the 16 presidential elections between the Civil War and the Great Depression, Republican candidates won all but 4. Republicans controlled the Senate in 27 out of 32 sessions in the same period. Republican dominance maintained a high protective tariff, an import tax designed to shield American businesses from foreign competition. Southern planters had opposed this policy before the war, but now could do nothing to stop it. It provided the protective foundation for a new American industrial order, while Spencer's social Darwinism provided moral justification for national policies that minimized government interference in the economy for anything other than the protection and support of business. Section 4. The Labor Movement. The ideas of social Darwinism attracted little support among the mass of American industrial laborers. American workers toiled in difficult jobs for long hours and little pay. Mechanization and mass production threw skilled laborers into unskilled positions. Industrial work ebbed and flowed with the economy. The typical industrial laborer could expect to be unemployed 1 month out of the year. They labored 60 hours a week and could still expect their annual income to fall below the poverty line. Among the working poor, wives and children were forced into the labor market to compensate. Crowded cities, meanwhile, failed to accommodate growing urban populations, and skyrocketing rents trapped families in crowded slums. Strikes ruptured American industry throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Workers seeking higher wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions had struck throughout the antebellum era, but organized unions were fleeting and transitory. The Civil War and Reconstruction seemed to briefly distract the nation from the plight of labor, but the end of the sectional crisis and the explosive growth of big business, unprecedented fortunes, and a vast industrial workforce in the last quarter of the 19th century sparked the rise of a vast American labor movement. The failure of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 convinced workers of the need to organize. Union memberships began to climb. The Knights of Labor enjoyed considerable success in the early 1880s, due in part to its efforts to unite skilled and unskilled workers. It welcomed all laborers, including women. The Knights barred only lawyers, bankers, and liquor dealers. By 1886, the Knights had over 700,000 members. The Knights envisioned a cooperative, producer-centered society that rewarded labor, not capital, but despite their sweeping vision, the Knights focused on practical gains that could be won through the organization of workers into local unions. In Marshall, Texas, in the spring of 1886, one of Jay Gould's rail companies fired a Knights of Labor member for attending a union meeting. His local union walked off the job, and soon others joined. From Texas and Arkansas into Missouri, Kansas, and Illinois, nearly 200,000 workers struck against Gould's rail lines. Gould hired strikebreakers and the Pinkerton Detective Agency, a kind of private security contractor, to suppress the strikes and get the rails moving again. Political leaders helped him, and state militias were enlisted in support of Gould's companies. The Texas governor called in the Texas Rangers. Workers countered by destroying property, which had the effect of winning them negative headlines, and for many justifying the use of strikebreakers and militiamen. The strike broke, briefly undermining the Knights of Labor, but the organization regrouped and set its eyes on a national campaign for the 8-hour day. The campaign for an 8-hour day, long a rallying cry that united American laborers, culminated in a national strike on May 1st, 1886. Somewhere around 400,000 workers struck across the country. In Chicago, police forces killed several workers while breaking up protesters at the McCormick Reaper Works. Labor leaders and radicals called for a protest at Haymarket Square the following day, which police also proceeded to break up. But as they did, a bomb exploded and killed 7 policemen. police fired into the crowd, killing 4. The deaths of the Chicago policemen sparked outrage across the nation, and the sensationalization of the Haymarket riot helped many Americans link unionism with radicalism. 8 Chicago anarchists were arrested and, despite a lack of direct evidence implicating them in the bombing, were charged and found guilty of conspiracy. 4 were hanged. 1 died by suicide before he could be executed. Membership in the Knights had peaked earlier that year, but fell rapidly after Haymarket. The group became associated with violence and radicalism. The national movement for an 8-hour day collapsed. So, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, emerged as a conservative alternative to the vision of the Knights of Labor. An alliance of craft unions, unions composed of skilled workers, the AFL rejected the Knights' expansive vision of a producerist economy and advocated pure and simple trade unionism, a program that aimed for practical gains, higher wages, fewer hours, and safer conditions through a conservative approach that tried to avoid strikes. But workers continued to strike. In 1892, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers struck at one of Carnegie's steel mills in Homestead, Pennsylvania. After repeated wage cuts, workers shut the plant down and occupied the mill. The plant's operator, Henry Clay Frick, immediately called in hundreds of Pinkerton detectives, but the steel workers fought back. The heavily armed Pinkertons attempting to approach the mill by river barges were besieged by the striking steel workers. After several hours of pitched battle, the Pinkertons surrendered. Angry workers forced them to run through a bloody gauntlet of clubs and fists before they were expelled from the mill grounds. The Pennsylvania governor called the state militia, broke the strike, and reopened the mill. The union was essentially destroyed in the aftermath. Still, despite repeated failure, strikes continued to roll across the industrial landscape. In 1894, workers in George Pullman's Pullman car factories struck when he cut wages by a quarter, but kept rents and utilities in his company town constant. The American Railway Union, ARU, led by Eugene V. Debs, launched a sympathy strike. The ARU would refuse to handle any Pullman cars on any rail line anywhere in the country. Thousands of workers struck, and national railroad traffic ground to a halt. Unlike in nearly every other major strike, the governor of Illinois sympathized with workers and refused to dispatch the state militia. It didn't matter. In July, President Grover Cleveland dispatched thousands of American soldiers to break the strike, and a federal court issued a preemptive injunction against Debs and the union's leadership. The strike violated the injunction, and Debs was arrested and imprisoned. Without the union's leadership, the strike evaporated. Jail radicalized Debs, proving to him that political and judicial leaders were merely tools for capital in its struggle against labor. But it wasn't just Debs. In 1905, the degrading conditions of industrial labor sparked strikes across the country. The final 2 decades of the 19th century saw over 20,000 strikes and lockouts in the United States. Industrial laborers struggled to carve for themselves a piece of the prosperity-lifting investors and a rapidly expanding middle class into unprecedented standards of living. But workers were not the only ones struggling to stay afloat in industrial America. American farmers also lashed out against the inequalities of the Gilded Age and denounced political corruption for enabling economic theft. The populist movement. Wall Street owns the country. The populist leader Mary Elizabeth Lease told dispossessed farmers around 1890, "It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street by Wall Street, and for Wall Street." Farmers, who remained a majority of the American population through the first decade of the 20th century, were hit especially hard by industrialization. The expanding markets and technological improvements that increased efficiency also decreased commodity prices. Commercialization of agriculture put farmers in the hands of bankers, railroads, and various economic intermediaries. As the decades passed, more and more farmers fell ever further into debt, lost their land, and were forced to enter the industrial workforce, or, especially in the South, became landless farm workers. The rise of industrial giants reshaped the American countryside and the Americans who called it home. Railroad spur lines and telegraph lines crept into farming communities and linked rural Americans, who also still made up a majority of the country's population, with towns, regional cities, American financial centers in Chicago and New York, and eventually London and the world's financial markets. Meanwhile, improved farm machinery, easy credit, and the latest consumer goods flooded the countryside. But the new connections and new conveniences came at a price. Farmers had always been dependent on the whims of the weather and local markets, but now they staked their financial security on a national economic system subject to rapid price swings, rampant speculation, and limited regulation. Frustrated, American farmers attempted to reshape the fundamental structures of the nation's political and economic systems, systems they believed enriched parasitic bankers and industrial monopolists at the expense of the many laboring farmers who fed the nation by producing its many crops and farm goods. Their dissatisfaction with an erratic and impersonal system put many of them at the forefront of what would become perhaps the most serious challenge to the established political economy of Gilded Age America. Farmers organized and launched their challenge first through the cooperatives of the Farmers Alliance and later through the politics of the People's or Populist Party. Mass production and business consolidation spawned giant corporations that monopolized nearly every sector of the U.S. economy in the decades after the Civil War. In contrast, the economic power of the individual farmer sank into oblivion. Threatened by ever-plummeting commodity prices and ever-rising indebtedness, Texas agrarians met in Lampasas, Texas in 1877 and organized the first Farmers Alliance to restore some economic power to farmers as they dealt with railroads, merchants, and bankers. If big business relied on its numerical strength to exert its economic will, why shouldn't farmers unite to counter that power? They could share machinery, bargain from wholesalers, and negotiate higher prices for their crops. Over the following years, organizers spread from town to town across the former Confederacy, the Midwest, and the Great Plains, holding evangelical-style camp meetings, distributing pamphlets, and establishing over 1,000 Alliance newspapers. As the Alliance spread, so too did its near-religious vision of the nation's future as a cooperative commonwealth that would protect the interests of the many from the predatory greed of the few. At its peak, the Farmers Alliance claimed 1.5 million members meeting in 40,000 local sub-alliances. The Alliance's most innovative programs were a series of farmers' cooperatives that enabled farmers to negotiate higher prices for their crops and lower prices for the goods they purchased. These cooperatives spread across the South between 1886 and 1892 and claimed more than 1 million members at their high point. While most failed financially, these philanthropic monopolies, as one Alliance speaker termed them, inspired farmers to look to large-scale organization to cope with their economic difficulties. But cooperation was only part of the Alliance message. In the South, Alliance-backed Democratic candidates won 4 governorships and 48 congressional seats in 1890. But at a time when falling prices and rising debts were conspiring against the survival of family farmers, the two political parties seemed incapable of representing the needs of poor farmers. And so Alliance members organized a political party, the People's Party, or the Populists as they came to be known. The Populists attracted supporters across the nation by appealing to those convinced that there were deep flaws in the political economy of Gilded Age America, flaws that both political parties refused to address. Veterans of earlier fights for currency reform, disaffected industrial laborers, proponents of the benevolent socialism of Edward Bellamy's popular Looking Backward, and the champions of Henry George's farmer-friendly single tax proposal joined Alliance members in the new party. The Populists nominated former Civil War General James B. Weaver as their presidential candidate at the party's first national convention in Omaha, Nebraska on July 4, 1892. At that meeting, the party adopted a platform that crystallized the Alliance's Cooperate program into a coherent political vision. The platform's preamble, written by longtime political iconoclast and Minnesota populist Ignatius Donnelly, warned that the fruits of the toil of millions had been boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few. Taken as a whole, the Omaha Platform and the larger populist movement sought to counter the scale and power of monopolistic capitalism with a strong, engaged, and modern federal government. The platform proposed an unprecedented expansion of federal power. It advocated nationalizing the country's railroad and telegraph systems to ensure that essential services would be run in the best interests of the people. In an attempt to deal with the lack of currency available to farmers, it advocated postal savings banks to protect depositors and extend credit. It called for the establishment of a network of federally managed warehouses called sub-treasuries, which would extend government loans to farmers who stored crops in the warehouses as they awaited higher market prices. To save debtors, it promoted an inflationary monetary policy by monetizing silver. Direct election of senators and the secret ballot would ensure that this federal government would serve the interest of the people rather than entrenched partisan interests, and a graduated income tax would protect Americans from the establishment of an American aristocracy. Combined, these efforts would, populists believed, help shift economic and political power back toward the nation's producing classes. In the populists' first national election campaign in 1892, Weaver received over 1 million votes and 22 electoral votes, a truly startling performance that signaled a bright future for the populists. And when the Panic of 1893 sparked the worst economic depression the nation had ever yet seen, the populist movement won further credibility and gained even more ground. One of the movement's most fervent speakers, Mary Lease, a Kansan, famously and perhaps apocryphally called on farmers to raise less corn and more hell. Populist stump speakers crossed the country, speaking with righteous indignation, blaming the greed of business elites and corrupt party politicians for causing the crisis fueling America's widening inequality. Southern orators like Texas's James Cyclone Davis and Georgian firebrand Tom Watson stumped across the South, decrying the abuses of Northern capitalists and the Democratic Party. Pamphlets such as W. H. Harvey's Coins Financial School and Henry D. Lloyd's Wealth Against Commonwealth provided populist answers to the age's many perceived problems. The faltering economy combined with the populists' extensive organizing. In the 1894 elections, populists elected 6 senators and 7 representatives to Congress. By the middle of the 1890s, populism had exploded in popularity. The first major political force to tap into the vast discomfort of many Americans with the disruptions wrought by industrial capitalism, the Populist Party seemed poised to capture political victory. And yet, even as populism gained national traction, the movement was stumbling. The party's often divided leadership found it difficult to shepherd what remained a diverse and loosely organized coalition of reformers toward unified political action. The Omaha Platform was a radical document, and some state party leaders selectively embraced its reforms. More important, the institutionalized parties were still too strong, and the Democrats loomed, ready to swallow populist frustrations and inaugurate a new era of American politics. Section 6, William Jennings, Bryan and the Politics of Gold. William Jennings. Bryan accomplished many different things in his life. He was a skilled orator, a Nebraska congressman, a 3-time presidential candidate, U.S. Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, and a lawyer who supported prohibition and opposed Darwinism, most notably in the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. In terms of his political career, he won national renown for his attack on the gold standard and his tireless promotion of free silver and policies for the benefit of the average American. Although Bryan was unsuccessful in winning the presidency, he forever altered the course of American political history. Bryan was born in Salem, Illinois, in 1860 to a devout family with a strong passion for law, politics, and public speaking. At 20, he attended Union Law College in Chicago and passed the bar shortly thereafter. After his marriage to Mary Baird in Illinois, Bryan and his young family relocated to Nebraska, where he won a reputation among the state's Democratic Party leaders as an extraordinary orator. Bryan later won recognition as one of the greatest speakers in American history. When economic depression struck the Midwest in the late 1880s, despairing farmers confronted with low crop prices found few politicians on their side. While many rallied to the populist cause, Bryan worked from within the Democratic Party, using the strength of his oratory. After delivering one speech, he told his wife, "Last night I found that I had a power over the audience. I could move them as I chose. I have more than usual power as a speaker. God grant that I may use it wisely." He soon won election to the House of Representatives, where he served for 2 terms. Although he lost a bid to join the Senate, Bryan turned his attention to a higher position, the presidency of the United States. There, he believed he could change the country by defending farmers and urban laborers against the corruptions of big business. In 1895-1896, Bryan launched a national speaking tour in which he promoted the free coinage of silver. He believed that bimetallism, by inflating American currency, could alleviate farmers' debts. In contrast, Republicans championed the gold standard and a flat money supply. American monetary standards became a leading campaign issue. Then, in July 1896, the Democratic Party's National Convention met to choose their presidential nominee in the upcoming election. The party platform asserted that the gold standard was not only un-American, but anti-American. Bryan spoke last at the convention. He astounded his listeners. At the conclusion of his stirring speech, he declared, "Having behind us the commercial interests and the laboring interests and all the toiling masses, we shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, 'You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.'" After a few seconds of stunned silence, the convention went wild. Some wept, many shouted, and the band began to play "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Bryan received the 1896 Democratic presidential nomination. The Republicans ran William McKinley, an economic conservative who championed business interests and the gold standard. Bryan crisscrossed the country, spreading the silver gospel. The election drew enormous attention and much emotion. According to Bryan's wife, he received 2,000 letters of support every day that year, an enormous amount for any politician, let alone one not currently in office. Yet Bryan could not defeat McKinley. The pro-business Republicans outspent Bryan's campaign fivefold. A notably high 79.3% of eligible American voters cast ballots, and turnout averaged 90% in areas supportive of Bryan. But Republicans swayed the Northeast and Midwest and stymied the Democrats. In early 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, which put the country on the gold standard, effectively ending the debate over the nation's monetary policy. Bryan sought the presidency again in 1900, but was again defeated, as he would be yet again in 1908. Bryan was among the most influential losers in American political history. When the agrarian wing of the Democratic Party nominated the Nebraska congressman in 1896, Bryan's fiery condemnation of Northeastern financial interests and his impassioned calls for free and unlimited coinage of silver co-opted popular populist issues. The Democrats stood ready to siphon off a large proportion of the populists' political support. When the People's Party held its own convention 2 weeks later, the party's moderate wing, in a fiercely contested move, overrode the objections of more ideologically pure populists and nominated Bryan as the populist candidate as well. This strategy of temporary fusion fatally fractured the movement and the party. Populist energy moved from the radical yet still weak People's Party to the moderate yet powerful Democratic Party. And although at first glance the populist movement appears to have been a failure, its minor electoral gains were short-lived, it did little to dislodge the entrenched two-party system, and the populist dream of a cooperative commonwealth never took shape in terms of lasting impact. The Populist Party proved the most significant third-party movement in American history. The agrarian revolt established the roots of later reform, and the majority of policies outlined within the Omaha Platform would eventually be signed into law over the following decades under the management of middle-class reformers. In large measure, the populist vision laid the intellectual groundwork for the coming progressive movement. Section 7. American Radicalism. Many varieties of economic and political radicalism pushed back against industrial capitalism's newfound American supremacy. Thousands identified as anarchists, for instance. more a political attitude than a fixed platform, anti-government dissidents, generally associated with German and other European immigrants, didn't just reject political and economic authority, they wanted to dismantle it, sometimes violently. When, amid the National 8-Hour Day May Day protests in 1886, an individual threw a pipe bomb into an advancing phalanx of policemen moving to break up a rally outside of a McCormick plant in Chicago, the police opened fire. The bomb had killed Officer Matthias Degen, and when the shooting subsided, 7 policemen and at least 4 protesters were dead. No one knew who threw the bomb, but police raided the offices of anarchist newspaper publisher August Spies and charged 8, including the prominent anarchist Albert Parsons, with conspiracy. With no direct evidence tying them to the bombing, a jury found them guilty, and 4 were hanged. 2 asked for clemency and received life in prison. 1 committed suicide on the eve of the hanging. Haymarket galvanized Americans against radicalism political traditions often associated with hyphenated Americans from Germany, Italy, Russia, and other hotbeds of European radicalism, and undermined support for the broader labor movement. Shut the national door to such anarchist scum, the Chicago Tribune wrote. Anarchism wasn't merely a specter conjured up by the Haymarket bombing, and Parsons and Spies weren't the movement's only prominent American champions. Russian-born Emma Goldman migrated to the United States in 1885 and became known as the High Priestess of Anarchy for her opposition to government, war, capitalism, religion, and even marriage, any phenomenon, she wrote, that oppressed the individual. Goldman and many other anarchists championed the concept of attentat, or propaganda of the deed, a targeted act of violence that could spark revolution. Goldman, her lover Alexander Berkman, and a third conspirator, for instance, tried and failed to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, a staunchly anti-union officer of Carnegie Steel who had dramatically decimated unionization at the Homestead Steel Works in Pennsylvania. Berkman served 14 years in prison. Others bombed the homes of prominent American capitalists and political leaders. And in 1901, anarchist Leon Czolgosz shot and killed President William McKinley. American socialists, meanwhile, carried on the populist radical economic tradition by uniting farmers and workers in a sustained, decades-long political struggle to reorder American economic life. Socialists argued that wealth and power were consolidated in the hands of too few individuals, that monopolies and trusts controlled too much of the economy, and that owners and investors grew rich while the workers who produced their wealth, despite massive productivity gains and rising national wealth, still suffered from low pay, long hours, and unsafe working conditions. Karl Marx had described the new industrial economy as a worldwide class struggle between the wealthy bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production, such as factories and farms, and the proletariat, factory workers, and tenant farmers, who worked only for the wealth of others. According to Eugene Debs, socialists sought the overthrow of the capitalist system and the emancipation of the working class from wage slavery. Under an imagined socialist cooperative commonwealth, the means of production would be owned collectively, ensuring that all men and women received a fair wage for their labor. According to socialist organizer and newspaper editor Oscar Ameringer, socialists wanted ownership of the trust by the government and the ownership of the government by the people. The socialist movement drew from a diverse constituency. Party membership was open to all regardless of race, gender, class, ethnicity, or religion. Many prominent Americans, such as Helen Keller, Upton Sinclair, and Jack London, became socialists. They were joined by masses of American laborers from across the United States, factory workers, miners, railroad builders, tenant farmers, and small farmers, all united under the red flag of socialism. Many united with labor leader William D. Big Bill Haywood and other radicals in 1905 to form the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. The Wobblies, a radical and confrontational union that welcomed all workers, regardless of race or gender. Others turned to politics. The Socialist Party of America, SPA, founded in 1901, carried on the American third-party political tradition. Socialist mayors were elected in 33 cities and towns, from Berkeley, California to Schenectady, New York, and two socialists, Victor Berger from Wisconsin and Meyer London from New York, won congressional seats. All told, over 1,000 socialist candidates won various American political offices. Julius A. Wayland, editor of the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason, proclaimed that socialism is coming. It's coming like a prairie fire, and nothing can stop it. You can feel it in the air. By 1913, there were 150,000 members of the Socialist Party, and in 1912, Eugene Debs, the Indiana-born Socialist Party candidate for president, received almost 1 million votes, or 6% of the total. Over the following years, however, the embrace of many socialist policies by progressive reformers, internal ideological and tactical disagreements, a failure to dissuade most Americans from the perceived incompatibility between socialism and American values, and especially government oppression and censorship, particularly during and after World War I, ultimately sank the party. Like the populace, however, socialists had tapped into a deep well of discontent, and their energy and organizing filtered out into American culture and American politics. Section 8, Conclusion. The March of Capital transformed American life. While some enjoyed unprecedented levels of wealth and an ever-growing slice of middle-class workers won an ever more comfortable standard of living, vast numbers of farmers lost their land, and a growing industrial working class struggled to earn wages sufficient to support themselves and their families. Industrial capitalism brought wealth, and it brought poverty. It created owners and investors, and it created employees. But whether winners or losers in the new economy, all Americans reckoned in some way with their new industrial world.